Hi, it's Kirby Summers. Today is January the 8th. We're already into the second week of 2025. I certainly hope your week is going well and that you're off to a really good start for the new year. I don't know if you guys make New Year's resolutions. This year, I didn't make one. I think I stopped doing it about 2 or 3 years ago, but I am curious if you've made a New Year's resolution. What is it? I know that when I go out in the mornings, I start seeing people, a lot of people wearing brand new uh running shoes, brand new gym attire. So I'm thinking that the number one thing that people do for the new year is to get in shape, which is not a bad thing. So this is the first of several podcasts I will be uploading either here if the subject permits it, meaning that I feel that it's safe on this platform, and or on my Patreon where I upload content that I speak, that some of my podcasts that are too sensitive and that I can't put on this platform. That said, I want to thank those of you who take a moment to like and to subscribe. Um, while everyone has been busy looking at the Sean Puff Diddy Combs allegations and the Jay-Z Beyonce information and sort of discussing this on that level and only going, let's say, as far as discussing Clive Davis and Jimmy Iovine, who I will be speaking about in these podcasts that I am lining up for you. I think that it's important to say that the people that we can see, such as Clive Davis and Jimmy Iovine, are still lower tier, meaning there's another tier or two above them. And so while I was going to start this by explaining, and I probably will add this to this podcast, a little bit more about Clive Davis's background, what I want to say is that if you are not familiar with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, you should try to just look into it. Uh, it is a three-letter agency program that was initiated in the 50s, and it used modern art. However, while the premise was to use, let's say, what they call soft methods versus strong propaganda, using art, and in this case, let's say American modern art, which included Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, as, let's say, weapons for the Cold War. And they did this, frankly, not just in the United States. They did this in many countries. It became known to the public. And then, of course, the same manner that MK Ultra was said to have been dissolved was only after it became public in 1974 when the close to 700 pages of the Family Jewels report was given to Seymour Hersh, who then wrote about it in the New York Times, which was geared at the middle class. And the middle class raised such a stink about it. I mean, these were middle class families. They read this. They were like, the CIA is doing things against us. And there was a very long list. And I have talked about the church committee hearings. However, my point here is that the minute that the public, you or I, a group of people, discover that a program indeed is a covert operation and it is leaked to be true, they say it has shut down. I will tell you that these programs have never shut down, and that after they started the music industry with the help of Nelson Rockefeller, and I bring up Nelson Rockefeller because we know that in Jay-Z's case, his label is Rockefeller. It's not a coincidence. All of this stuff actually comes under one umbrella, and it's not Jay-Z, it's not Beyonce, and it's not Sean Diddy Puffy Combs, whatever he wants to be called. It is the umbrella that we can perhaps look at as the combination of the five eyes. And you guys are smart enough to know what the five eyes are. You know, they're the intel operations for the five English-speaking countries. However, I've always said that there are six eyes. It's a six-eye operation because it does include the country that was started in 1945 that starts with the letter I, and they too are apprised of what happens either with the intelligence agency in the US, the ones in the UK, the ones in Australia, so on and so forth. So one of the museums that was used for this sort of like covert operation in modern art was the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. And we, to present day, can recall that the person who sat on the board of directors was Leon Black, who we can connect to Jeff. Now, all of this, frankly, is they're just one person separations. There are no 6 degrees of separation here. And so while other channels, again, go into, oh, this is bigger than, I'm sorry, it's just that it takes years of study, in my opinion, given the fact that I have put in well over a decade of study just trying to figure things out as it pertained to my own life and my own experience and people trying to unalive me and seeing who's connected to what and this connects here, that connects there. And in the end, all the connections intertwined. So I listen to something and then I have to turn it off because, oh, this is bigger than this rapper and it's bigger than that rapper. And it's like, for me, it's like a major duh, and the layers actually point to a very interesting place that I have discovered. However, I'm not going to be telling you where specifically on this podcast. I am going to be breaking it down for you as best as I can so that, basically, when there was a cultural shift in the United States between Paris and New York, commencing like in the 1930s, um, the predecessor of the three-letter agency was basically brought in. I mean, before we had the OSS, the United States Navy had an intelligence division. We've always had an intelligence division. We've had a War Department. And then but the agency was mainly staffed by Yale and Harvard graduates. It was never staffed, let's say, with somebody like Jeff. Somebody like Jeff was later used as assets, which is what Alex Acosta said, right? Um, Many of these Harvard and Yale grads collected art and wrote novels. And so, in addition to the art, we have people who wrote books. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but Nabokov's cousin was part of the head of the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And so that the book Lolita was in fact sponsored by the three-letter agency. This book, I don't know if you're aware, it became not just a movie about the people that we study on this platform who have a fondness for not of age, but it was also Jeff's favorite book, and he had many copies of this throughout his homes. Donald Jameson was the first person to break the silence, and he did this decades ago. He said that the agency, meaning the three-letter agency, they saw abstract expressionism as an opportunity and ran with it. So they said that it helped because Moscow in those days was very vicious in denouncing nonconformity. And so that the Americans could be viewed differently, the three-letter agency had to make sure that their sponsoring of these avant-garde artists, which later, of course, included Andy Warhol, as I have stated on this platform, would never be exposed, except clearly we're talking about it today so that it has been exposed. They called it, however, a long leash, so that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was basically a collection of intellectuals, writers, historians, poets, and artists. It was set up with three-letter agency funds in the 1950s, and it was run by an actual agent, meaning somebody who worked full-time and who wore, a suit and probably a hat. In those days, they liked hats. It was how they felt they could defend against Moscow. And at the height of this deep covert activity, which was spread across many countries, they did have offices in 35 countries. They published more than 24 magazines, including Encounter. And it also gave the three-letter agency the ideal front to promote its covert interest in abstract expressionism. And then it became sort of the official sponsor of touring exhibitions. So when we hear about an art exhibition touring, and later, frankly, about bands touring the world, what you really are seeing, because we're getting into the music industry, right? We're in fact studying this as the Sean Diddy Combs case has come to the surface. But that's all people are discussing, and they're missing the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that these are funded. And I will be eventually discussing Jimmy Iovine and Clive Davis and the layers above and the layers below. And so that they didn't want the artists to find out. However, I'm sure that some of them did. So in the case of, let's say, Andy Warhol, he knew because then he opened up a school, which I believe is also a long arm of the intelligence agencies that is connected to the British government and the British royals, to be specific. The preeminent founder was theoretically, on paper, Nelson Rockefeller, whose mother had co-founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And she gave him the title of president of the museum, and he used to go around calling it Mummy's Museum. And Rockefeller was, on paper, the biggest backer of abstract expressionism. However, it wasn't his money. It was the money funneled through him by the three-letter agency. So the museum was also linked to the three-letter agency by other, what they called bridge people. One of these was William Paley, who was the president of CBS Broadcasting and a founding father of the three-letter agency. And I want you at this moment to understand that CBS had a record division of which Clive Davis would become head of. So we can see right here a straight line connection of CBS, William Paley, to the three-letter agency and to the covert operation known as Congress of Cultural Freedom, which you can look up. You can just, I don't suggest using the Google platform, but you can use any platform. It doesn't really matter. So they basically said at the time they wanted to unite all people who were writers, who were musicians. That said, I also want to discuss or at least mention briefly, that the Beatles were in fact created. They didn't just happen naturally. And I know that there are many Beatles fans who really get very upset when anybody mentions the fact that they were indeed a creation of Tavistock, but they were, and many of you have heard this. However, just as we are learning that Jay-Z was a creation, that Sean Combs was a creation, so were the Beatles. So it didn't just happen again in this country. It happened in other countries, and it included the music industry. And there are connections to the Beatles, let's say from the Beatles to Jimmy Iovine, to Harvey Weinstein, to Wexy person, to Ep person, to Mike Jeffries. Like, there are just all of these odd connections, and those I am covering on my Substack primarily in my series Weird Scenes in Liverpool. They encouraged everyone that they had to be very secret. However, it really wasn't that secret. I mean, the art ended up everywhere in banks, in airports, in city halls, in boardrooms, and in great galleries. In 1958, the first so-called touring exhibition of the New American Painting included works by Pollock, de Kooning, Motherwell, and others, and it was on show in Paris. So you now start having, just like we exchange and we have musicians going into other countries, now we have actually a three-letter agency sponsored art show going into Paris. Another millionaire, Julius Fleischmann, who's from the very well-known Fleischmann family, who is originated basically in Ohio, and who I went into very deeply in my series on Wexy, deconstructing Wexner, which is 15 parts, and it's still ongoing. But Fleischman was an asset. He was a three-letter agency asset. Now, you probably are familiar with that name, Fleischman, as it pertains to a couple of financial scandals, and perhaps I will podcast about that some other time, but it also connects to the now infamous attorney for the Jeff victims, David Boies. Um, there's a lot in the Fleischman line that gives you lots of nooks and crannies to investigate. So theoretically, he stepped in with the money, and the show was brought to London. However, again, the money that Fleischman provided, the same thing can be said about Wexy. The same thing can be said about Leon Black. The monies provided through these people were not theirs. It's money that was, in fact, from the three-letter agency. And it came through a foundation. So foundations, as many of you are learning, are in fact fronts in many cases. These foundations are vehicles through which they can move money to do different things. In this particular case, as it connects to Fleischman, the money came through the Fairfield Foundation, of which he was the president, but he was not, it was really, he was just a conduit for the transfer of covert money. So unknown to, let's say, to the Tate, to the public or the artists, the exhibition was transferred to London at American taxpayers' expense to serve propaganda purposes. So Tom Braden, who was in the three-letter agency, and we're talking about years ago, described how conduits like the Fairfield Foundation were set up. He said we would go to somebody in New York who was a well-known rich person, and we would say we want to set up a foundation. We would tell him what we were trying to do and pledge him to secrecy. And he would say, of course, I'll do it. And then you would publish a letterhead and put that person's name on it, and there would be a foundation. It was really a pretty simple device. And so, again, Julius Fleischman was very well placed for this role. He sat on the board of the international program of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as did very powerful figures close to CIA. The Museum of Modern Art continues a relationship with the three-letter agency to present day. Now, Clive Davis, as you know, worked for CBS, which I've just described to you, was one of the founders of the three-letter agency, belonged to the three-letter agency, and and sometimes people do come under investigation because maybe there's somebody who is working for the other agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigations or something else, and comes across something that is part of all of these companies, and that is the trafficking of substances. And I'm pausing here because I want to underscore and emphasize the substance movement. Because in reality, when you look at how the UK began, it was all about that. Okay? And so there was something called Project Sound in the 1970s. It was a nationwide investigation into the Black music industry and allegations of various unsavory practices. So it included 19 people who were indicted from 6 corporations. And these people were spread out in New York, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. Among the people indicted was Clive Davis, Kenneth Gamble and Leon Huff of Philadelphia International Records, and Nat Tarnopol of Brunswick Records. So in the next podcast, I will discuss Clive Davis.